the last time we spoke was during actually like a poignant moment of like of concern, right? Like I've been thinking about this a lot of like how media they perform this concern of like, oh, we're concerned as like a class of people for these people, these human beings in some, usually some, almost entirely in some far off land, and we're worried about them and we're frantically upset by any kind of injustice to them. So I realized like that was the last time we spoke, and it's so crazy how like the amount that like they pretended to care about, say, Ukrainians, about Iranians, about, you know, whatever, and then how they like openly don't care about Palestinians like that. You just have to like live with that.
It kind of just gives the whole game away, doesn't it? Like it's hard for anyone that's working in this kind of ecosystem, either in politics or media, to pretend that anything that they say is real, you know, at this point, when it's very clearly selectively deployed, very generously, I would say, describe it as being selectively deployed kind of outrage or concern, um, versus this situation where we're witnessing over the last couple of months one of the most fucking depraved like events that I think any of us have ever seen. And we've lived through some, you know, we're getting up there in the years, and we've lived through some horrible moments. And this is one of the most depraved one of them. And, you know, complete either silence from our media class, maybe some light hand wringing, while ultimately just ginning up support for the monsters that are doing the genocide and the mass murder. It's really, really something else, actually.
So yeah, this is this episode is called "What the hell is wrong with Canada?" And we're gonna attempt to ask the question, "What the hell is wrong with Canada?" Because it's strange, you know. We talk. I think we talked about this a little bit before, but like, you know, we live in the sort of like we're the satellite of the U.S., right? Like the big evil empire, and so it's, and also like Canada is relatively small. Like we're smaller than the population of California, and our, you know, like our foreign policy footprint is basically to follow whatever footsteps that the US the US sort of like whatever foolhardy adventure the US sort of is going on, Canada goes along with notable exceptions like Iraq 2003. But like I think it's interesting at this point to think of, that's in terms of like our foreign policy, but like the that doesn't make it less insanely like imperialistic and psychotic. And so like what's interesting to think about how liberals are leading this genocidal war in like leading the charge, really. I mean, like the Biden regime is responsible for this genocidal war. Like the decisions that like Israeli policymakers make is in tandem with the US empire. So like this is like when we talk about like Iranian proxies, like the Israel is like the greatest proxy, and not just for the US, but for like the EU, obviously too. And so like there's an interesting thing that's happening with the machinery of kind of liberal interventionism or liberal sort of humanitarian concern, the performance, because this is not something that like conservatives particularly deal with, right? Like this is not, they don't trade in these garb, like they're like blood and soil nationalists most of the time, whereas for liberal class it's again that concern or like the performance of concern. It's like, oh, it's terrible what's happening in Ukraine, oh, it's terrible what's happening in Iran. But like we see, like we see that like on the flip side though is that like the same political sort of geopolitical alignment, you know, reflects onto Canada too. So I was hoping we could sort of get into, you know, we never talked about the Hunka affair, Hunka burn and racism affair, which
It
was
was
this.
one of my favorite things to ever happen in this country, following the news in this country. I was
Can
just
you
having an
actually,
absolute
can we
great
go
time
into
watching
it?
that happen.
Because it's an interesting kind of like appetizer for this thing. So tell us, people who don't know, can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, well, we invited Zelensky into our parliament, and it was very funny because the liberal, like the Justin Trudeau, Chrystia Freeland, and like the Melanie Joly and the whole kind of cabinet, it was kind of there. They felt so we're important. Like, look, he's coming to talk to Canada. We're a part of this big struggle, you know, against the evil, bad Russians. You know, Chrystia Freeland, it's her whole life's work. It's like the culmination of her life's work.
Generations of her family's work.
Exactly. Yeah. Absolutely. To kind of create this sort of uh, Ukrainian nationalism, anti-Soviet, anti-Russian, that kind of whitewashes these kind of Ukrainian nationalist figures from the past. Um, so they invite Zelensky to the parliament. You know, everyone gives him the big standing ovation, and then the Speaker of the House in the parliament says, "And now, as a special guest, we've invited this brave Ukrainian hero from the past who fought the Russians during World War II." And introduced this guy, and gave a big wave to everyone. And like that was the funny thing for me, is because so everyone in the whole parliament stands up and applauds, and that was verbatim what he said. Not
All the social democrats
oh yeah,
too.
no, they were all there, they're all smiling. And that was my favorite part, was definitely Christy Freeland's face in that moment, just beaming with pride. Like, it was just the absolute best day of her entire career, this stuff. And that was the main. I messed. I don't know what the beginning of the intro was, but that was verbatim what he said. He fought the Russians during World War II, and I think even watching it, it was almost so blatant that I kind of skipped over it. I almost wasn't really paying attention because I was thinking more about the Zelensky thing. And then later on that evening, you see people start like taking that clip and posting it and being like, "Wait, well, fought who in World War II? Like, what is
Yeah.
this?" And I really believe that it was the sort of like tanky shit posters on Twitter that helped turn that into a big scandal. I think everyone would have probably rather just turned the page on that. And probably if it hadn't become a big scandal, with like, especially with like even Zionists, like Jewish groups getting involved and being like, "Hey, that's actually not okay." These Jewish groups that are normally like B'nai B'rith or whatever, that are normally all about kind of like propagating this kind of Zionist propaganda, they started complaining as well and saying like, "Whoa, what the fuck? Like, why are you applauding this guy?" And as people looked into his past and what that actually meant, those words, fought the Russians during World War II, which led to this a big international scandal. Yeah, it was just amazing for me because I've been watching this stuff. I've been watching this stuff play out and talking a lot about the Ukraine conflict and how it's not quite as black and white as our media class and political class would have us believe, and the role of these like um, Ukrainian nationalists in the movement that we've been promoting and arming and funding, and the way they've been rehabilitating these people like Stepan Bandera, who helped perpetrate the Holocaust and committed these terrible atrocities against Jewish communities and Polish communities. Um, so it was this crazy moment where all of that really came to a head, and the quiet part was said out loud, and we got this just amazing image of the Canadian Parliament, including Zelensky, uh, applauding this guy. And that was actually another funny part of this thing, is people are like, "We should apologize to Zelensky, apologize to the Ukrainians." It's like, why? They love this guy. They go tell them what this guy was about, and they probably think it was like, "Yeah, great, good. We think this guy's fantastic." The idea that Zelensky didn't know, the idea that Chrystia Freeland didn't know what the implications of that were, the entire that everyone in our fucking parliament didn't understand who was fighting the Russians during World War II. It's just incredible, right? That was their whole excuse. We're just so stupid. We're just so stupid and ignorant. We just didn't put this together. We didn't vet this guy. We didn't Google this guy enough. But the idea that they don't know, like, these are not stupid people, I don't think. I mean, maybe kind of a little bit, but I don't think they're that stupid. But it was more just like a "we're sorry we got caught" kind of thing, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, and the crazy thing about that is that like and I remember, yeah, they did say they fought the Russians, and then you think about that, it's like not even factually true because it was a Soviet army, and the Soviet army was this like multi-ethnic, and also included Ukrainians too. So like what liberals, the like liberal
Millions of
bloodlust
Ukrainians, yeah.
on like the liberal bloodlust on Ukraine is so insane because it openly rejects like a large portion of Ukrainian history, which the role of of Ukraine in the history of the Soviet Union is just written off, and one side of the Ukrainian diaspora, which happened to show up here in the 40s and the 50s, gee, I wonder why, like what were they leaving? Why were they leaving? And like that confirmation bias then gets translated into like generations of anti-communists that like you meet on the street here. Like I meet some Ukrainians here, and definitely I don't bring up Russia because I know better. But like Ukraine is a large country with tens of millions of people. If you really want to play the game of this group of like right-wing nationalists speaks for the whole, then don't then like then don't get mad when like like other countries around the world invite the trucker convoy people and like placard like show them around, right? Like this is the strange double game that liberals in particular like to play, that they under the guise of like concern and like ethical, like ethical whatever, they find like the most reactionary forces and they put them up because the most reactionary forces are aligned with their foreign policy, because the liberals are the reactionary forces now. I mean, and they have been for a long time. It's just that sheen of respectability and concern, and like Justin Trudeau wearing "I am a feminist" or like "This is what a feminist looks like" t-shirt. Like we live like these are some cynical fucking ghouls who think like nothing of our intelligence. Like we're talking about like they're destroying, like they're destroying a country called Ukraine by funding this insane proxy war and like helping it along, and at the same time employing this insanely racist, like immigration policy where Ukrainians, like the door is flung open to any Ukrainian who can afford to leave, right? Middle classes usually and upper classes who can then come here and set up lives, no problem. But like ask like a Gazan, they're letting in like 1,000, and all of those people are insanely vetted. Like it's crazy. And like even that clip of like Justin Trudeau like saying like, oh, there's a genocide in Ukraine and like keeping mom on Gaza, like this whole sort of inflection of foreign policy of the liberals is now being shown for like how bogus it is. So I'm thinking like what, like, so I guess I want to ask the question like what the hell is wrong with Canadian foreign policy? Like first of all, do we have a foreign policy, or are we just like a side note to the US?
Yeah, I mean that's always been my understanding of it, is that we're a junior partner in the empire, right? We're like the on the playground, the US is the big bully and we're the ones behind it going like, yeah, yeah, like threatening people with the big bully in front of us. And
Like one of Biff's goons, like the goons
yeah, we're one
in
of
Back to
Biff's
the
goons.
Future.
That's how I would say, yeah.
Like that's all we are.
Exactly. We're like Flea. We're Flea from Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Yeah.
Um but that's it. Like you pointed out with Iraq, with there's certain other cases where there might be some kind of a difference, or we might not be involved in this or that, or we might have a different sort of rhetorical stance. But I think it's mostly performative. Okay, yeah, I think yeah, that's it. I think it's mostly performative. It's mostly just like a good cop, bad cop routine. Whether it comes to Iraq, whether it comes to Cuba, whether it comes to Vietnam, for example, we might have slightly different stances. We might not get involved in certain things, but we're also not meaningfully doing anything to challenge the US and what it's doing. You know, um, we're simply kind of just taking this other stance. We're providing a sort of different viewpoint from the part of the sort of the empire or the West or the rules based order or the Fourth Reich, whatever you want to call it. But we're not really meaningfully doing anything to challenge that. I think Vietnam's a good example too, because like we weren't involved in Vietnam. A lot of like soldiers that didn't want to go, deserters came here to escape the draft and stuff like that. We're still, like I said, we're still not doing anything to challenge the US on its Vietnam policy. We're also still producing chemical weapons and napalm stuff here that gets shipped over there and dropped on Vietnamese villagers, while we're simultaneously kind of taking this moral high ground. So I think sometimes you might point to some differences like that, but ultimately, yeah, we're the flea, we're the goon, or the thug, or whatever you want to call it, the
And
henchman.
because yeah, like the weird reputation that Canadians like inculcate in themselves is that, oh, we're not the evil empire of the US, at least liberal, some kind of liberal or sort of whatever social democratic. I mean, it's hard to say. Canada is a relatively big country. It's got a lot of different people in it with different opinions, so it's not like there's a simple way of like representing it. But at the same time, there is this kind of branding that Canada likes to sort of sell as, oh, we're this like, so we believe in. I remember that stupid, remember when we were kids, and that horrible "I am Canadian" thing. And one of the lines
Yeah,
was like,
that's our culture. That's It was
I believe
invented
in
in that
peacekeeping,
campaign.
not empire," or some shit like that. I'll clip it in
Yes.
here. But like, I was like, no, you don't. That's not even true. Excuse me.
No, I tell people this often, like literally like what a lot of people in our generation think of as like Canadian culture was literally from that ad campaign. Like they literally cooked up this ad campaign and sold that to us and we were like, "Yes, this is good."
Yes,
Our whole culture comes from a fucking beer commercial and like Tim Hortons, I guess. We there's
yes.
like showing up early to the hockey rink with a fucking bad coffee. I don't know. That's our culture that we cherish so much. It's
Cana-
embarrassing.
Hey, I'm not a lumberjack or a fur trader, and I don't live in an igloo or eat blubber or own a dog sled. I have a prime minister, not a president. I can proudly sew my country's flag on my backpack. I believe in peacekeeping, not policing. Diversity, not assimilation. And that the beaver is a truly proud and noble animal. A toque is a hat. A Chesterfield is a coach. And it is pronounced Z, not Z. Z. Canada is the second largest landmass, the first nation of hockey, and the best part of North America. My name is Joe, and I am Canadian.
Canadian national identity is very flimsy. The more you look at it, like it's a flimsy
Oh yeah.
um, attempt to like station yourself or sort of like create yourself out of this relatively like again like a footnote or like a footnote to a larger sort of settler colonial project, which is what Canada is, right? Like it's this weird offshoot of British imperialism, like the US, that didn't develop into the superpower that the US did, but into like the superpowers resource hub. And like, and a place where, and like a weird, but because of, I think, public health care, I think, and like the sort of nominally social democratic like undertones to Canadian neoliberalism, like that's basically holding it together. I feels like the idea that like Canada is not the US. So it's like this kind of negative identity. But then on top of that, like, when you see the maple leaf, like, yeah, like what is it? It's like this hollow signifier of like bland, like it actually I the more I age, the more I realize that Justin Trudeau is like the perfect Canadian in a way,
Oh
because it's
yeah.
like pure artifice, and underneath like a sort of liberal humanitarian artifice, but underneath is this like cynical like warmongering monster. So like in a weird way it's like a, yeah, like he's actually a like a well, like he's a deserving, like we deserve a guy like Justin Trudeau as the leader. Like he should just stay leader, because who else can do it better?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like that's what's been absolutely hilarious also about this kind of growing reactionary movement in this country as well, that view him, they really think he's this like communist, like left wing Marxist or something. It's really incredible, and they're holding up Pierre Polyev as being some kind of like working class hero, this like absolute nerd, lifelong conservative political operative. um no, but it's true, like it is really flimsy, and it's amazing for me sometimes. Like I mentioned, I grew up in eastern Ontario in a small town of Brockville, Ontario. I think I talked to you about that before. And I'm very like would be very ripe to accept this framing and accept this kind of version of Canadian identity, and through some miracle I managed to kind of deprogram myself from it, by some combination of taking psychedelic drugs when I was a teenager and learning about Marxism and stuff like that. And you start to realize, like, oh shit, all that is just completely fake. Yeah, oh, wow. So, but you see how a lot of people totally buy into that exact framing, as flimsy as it is. There's a lot of people in this country that believe it, and a lot of people around the world that believe it too.
Maybe we can sort of, for people who don't understand the sort of like geography of Canada and its population, maybe this would be a funny time to go into it, because I think our last episode too, we talked about the weird role Quebec plays in the sort of dynamics of Canada because of its population. But then we can also talk about Alberta, because Alberta is the kind of like dark bizarro world Quebec, where like, and where it's like this weird
Yeah.
outpost of like Western cowboyism in and they adopt that identity. Like they have cowboy hats, like they think of themselves as the West, even though there's
Yep.
like far more Western provinces that like don't use the rhetoric of like cowboyism.
Yeah, I mean, you're even seeing this kind of like growing kind of secessionist movement in Texas right now, and you see the same thing in Alberta. The Alberta exit people that want to have their own little cowboy, a little, or just be a little part of America society. You know?
Yeah, so can maybe explain a little bit of of Alberta, because Alberta plays a strange role, right? Because it is also like a huge source of wealth for like the Canadian state, but it is a kind of like it sort of fashions itself as this bad boy and like a kind of alternative to like the other provinces. Like it's not it's not like liberal BC, like British Columbia, and it's not Quebec, and it's not Ontario. That it has its own identity, and because of its population and its resources, it does try, I mean, but it fails to kind of throw its weight around. So maybe explain Alberta to people who might not know.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you did a pretty good job setting the table there. It's a place that I try not to visit very very much. you know, I've been a few times, but I think you kind of nailed it there. I think there's been this effort to kind of adopt this uh, sort of a little pocket nation inside the country. I guess that's really based around, it's like a petro state. It's like a little pocket petro state, basically, where the whole like oil and gas industry has become like an essential kind of part of people's identities, in addition to all the kind of cowboy stuff that you're talking about. And similar to where that kind of identity sort of pops up everywhere. I think it's kind of this like hostage situation thing where you have these massive conglomerates that are the ones that are really profiting from that, and people have been kind of convinced that these companies are somehow on their side or working for them or trying to improve their lives in any way, when all they're really interested in doing is just siphoning out all the resources and putting it into the bank accounts of the shareholders and CEOs and board members of these largely foreign countries that are part of the sort of oil and gas industry. And like there's been this, and despite all the environmental consequences as well of the whole, like the tar sands and the oil and gas production there, just massive like tailing ponds of like fucking toxic chemicals, and just the landscape has been just absolutely decimated by this industry. But any efforts to kind of like regulate that or rein it in or try to initiate some kind of a transition into more green energy is met with this like almost violent hostility. Um, like the whole idea of even having like a carbon tax, which has basically been the centerpiece of like Trudeau's sort of neoliberal approach to climate legislation, has been met there with like this like all this like apocalyptic anger, and the idea that like that's the reason why because people are losing their jobs, people have making less and less money, less and less ability to kind of like profit from the working class standpoint in this industry. And there's this kind of like Stockholm syndrome mentality where instead of blaming the oil and gas companies for exploiting the land and exploiting the people, giving some people that work in the industry a few crumbs, giving a few like people that live in the province a few crumbs, while largely just extracting all the profits for themselves. And people have this mentality that like when you try to challenge them, that you're attacking them personally, you're attacking their lifestyle. Um, and that's the kind of, I think, mentality that a lot of Albertans have. Then there's a lot of wonderful people in Alberta, I should say, as well, that I know of, especially in the cities, and a lot of people that have really great values, progressive values. But this is largely the people that are sort of like overseeing the political climate there. Yeah, well, I think it's worth pointing out, because I think what I was saying a moment ago was talking about when the NDP tried to become the leading party in Alberta, and the NDP, the Social Democratic Party, the party that's going to be better on all these issues. And you saw just time and time again in Alberta, even if they were trying to give some kind of semblance of red bear kind of social democratic policies, they were still trying to be the nice reactionary party. And we're going to work with the oil companies. We don't want to go against them. We're not going to do any kind of just transition. We're not going to meaningfully like push back against the way that like our province is being exploited, either environmentally or politically or economically. We're going to be the good, responsible pipeline oil and gas party. And they absolutely got decimated by these like blood drinking reactionaries who still viewed them as being, uh, green communists, basically. So, I mean, it's the same kind of situation in BC, like you said. I think as a sort of society, I think it has kind of a semblance of being a lot more tolerant, a lot less reactionary than a place like Alberta. You have the NDP in power there as well, and have implemented policies that you can talk about that are good. I think. I mean, I'm not from BC. It's a but it's there are things you can point to. There's also things like the ways that under the NDP, they've still been like sending out, RCMP thugs to like bust up these uh, indigenous blockades, protesting the Coastal GasLink pipeline and these kinds of things. So you also it's a province, especially like in the cities, that's completely like at the mercy of these like real estate developers. Housing is just an absolutely the housing crisis in BC is probably just as bad as anywhere. And despite having a social democratic party, you don't see them meaningfully really doing anything about that either. Not really building public housing, not really doing anything to push back against the landlords or the real estate developers. So this is all just to say that the NDP, even though they might have this kind of uh, nominally social democratic veneer, you see when they're actually in charge of these provinces, it's just kind of a different flavor of Canadian reactionary, with maybe a slightly different rhetoric, maybe a few more um, crumbs given to the masses, basically. And so yeah, there was some kind of Zoom call with Selena Robinson, who I guess is the education minister in the BC NDP, and who since October 7th also has been working with these like Zionist groups to like revamp Holocaust education in BC and basically tie in the whole idea of the Holocaust with Israel and kind of promote this idea that this is very like central kind of cog in Zionist propaganda about the role of Israel and like protecting Jewish people and being in response to the Holocaust. Um, and then was doing this Zoom call and was talking about Palestine, and we just basically gave this very basically a standard white supremacist kind of colonizer mentality when she talked about the land that Israel is founded on. And we see this we in the same thing gets said about the foundation of Canada, the settlement of Canada and the United States and Central and South America. Just basically like, oh, this is just some crappy piece of land. Nothing was growing on it. And the people there weren't doing anything with it. Yeah. There was a few 100,000 people, but like there's no real like economy. There's no real society there. And until Israel came in and breathed life into this land,
We have a whole generation, and we know from the data that it's 18 to 34-year-olds that have no idea about the Holocaust. They don't even think it happened. They don't even understand that Israel was was offered to the Jews who were displaced. So they have no connection to how it started. They don't understand that it was a crappy piece of land with nothing on it. There were several 100,000 people, but other than that, it didn't produce an economy. It couldn't grow things. It didn't have anything on it, and that it was the folks who were displaced that came, and the people who had been living there for generations, and together they worked hard, and they had their own battles, right? We know the history.
And again, this is not just about exclusive to Israel. This is the kind of colonizer mentality, I think, that people talk about the settlement of North America, Central South America, and people got very angry about that because it's this very racist trope. This idea that it's just nothing was going on there, nothing grows there until until Israel settled the land, and then they established these beautiful cities and this wonderful economy and all this green environment. And well, people got really angry about that, especially in the context of what's happening right now, this genocidal mass murder campaign that we're fully supporting, and that she, as a Zionist, also supports, regardless of what her rhetoric is about that. People got really upset about it. She did get, ultimately, after all the pressure that she was getting, removed from her post by the David Eby, the premier of BC. And I think that's been the amazing thing for me, is that there's been more of a backlash over the fact that she got consequences for these like ignorant statements. There's been more of this backlash over that than anything that she said, or the fact that our government is supporting this like fucking genocide in Gaza. And now the latest thing that's happened, and this also speaks to how completely pathetic most people in any kind of institutionally left position is in this country. Um, so not only did she, lose her position, and she's had to apologize. She's apparently had to take like Islamophobic sensitivity training or something like that. Um, but some pro Palestine activists went to her office and wrote a bunch of slogans on the ground, a bunch of slogans in chalk: "Free Palestine, Free Gaza, We don't accept your apology." They put posters. There was one that said "Zionism equals Nazism," like on her office. And now there's been this big like circling of the wagons moment with people in the media class and the political class being like, "Oh, this has gone too far now. This is disgusting."
Yeah.
And it's not just like centrists or reactionaries or liberals doing this, but all the people that are in the NDP, in the NDP establishment chiming in. Jagmeet Singh is saying, "We got to draw the line here, but these hateful messages being left on the sausage on the ground and outside the office." You see, uh, oh, sorry, I'm fucking blanking on his name. Uh, Avi Lewis, excuse me, Avi Lewis, who's Naomi Klein's husband,
Mr.
who's
Naomi
been
Klein.
like exactly, yeah. And you know what? In his credit, he's gone pretty hard over the last 3 months, in 3 4 months, in defending Palestinians and criticizing Israel. But he gets involved too, like, "Oh, this is just someone trying to discredit the movement. No one should pay attention to this. Like, this is just childish and immature." Jagmeet Singh is talking about how hateful it is.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just amazing. And there's been more of a backlash over that than anyone that actually supports the mass murder of Palestinian little kids. And I think that says pretty much all you need to know about how our political class operates across the political spectrum, and our media class as well. There's been way more hand wringing over this than the over 30,000 people that have died with our full support over the last 4 months.
Yeah, and what's crazy is that you have this like, I mean, she's talking that the clip of her, she's talking to B'nai B'rith, which is the right flank, the right wing
Yeah,
flank of the Zionist lobby in Canada. Hard right. I mean, these are ultra nationalist Zionists. They're not
yeah,
like some liberal Zionists, but at a certain point, though, you realize that the difference that, like, when it comes down to waging a genocidal war, shooting children, shooting babies, like letting them starve, like letting their corpses rot, watching them expire in a hospital, that the liberal media class will take the far right flank of the Zionist movement happily. So at this point, you have Jesse Brown, the founder and like leader of Canada Land, who for 4 months has been falsely like sending out like accusing people of anti-Semitism, has been playing the same game that Zionists always play, which is conflating Zionism with Judaism, which is like the most cynical, which can be easily undone with the fact that like a growing number of Jews in Canada, partly because of Israel itself, are now anti-Zionist proudly and loudly. And the fact that like this is too much for guys like Jesse Brown. Like Jesse Brown would rather see his media project that he's built up for like what, a decade and a half? How old is Canada
yeah,
Land at this point? Like it's pretty old.
something like that. Yeah,
Like he'd rather smash it to the ground to defend Zionism. And like he's been doing it constantly. Like, it's insane. Like and this is like an ostensibly liberal Canadian character. Like it's crazy. Like it's so that
yeah.
like it's
Like,
as if like the October 7th like triggered in a class of people this like deeper reactionary it's like deeper reactionary operating system that was always lingering in them, that had this overlay of like it's almost typically Canadian, right? Like social democracy,
yeah,
liberalism. Oh, we're not like a fascist, whatever. But like their foreign policy is not like they're no different than Trump, like in effect, right? The same
yeah.
people who decried Trump for 4 years, who threatened to like jump off of buildings, right? In the end, produce the same, like agree with like the same fundamental like political principles when it comes to certain issues, right? When it comes to other stuff, they'll break with him. But like, no, when it comes to Zionism, no, we're ultra nationalist Zionists. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's been. I think that's been one of the most fascinating elements of this is seeing that mask slip for a lot of people. And I think the Ukraine thing kind of started it. Like we saw the
Yeah.
whole support for fascism in Ukraine. You see a crack in the facade there. The Hunka thing was the ultimate example of that. really spelling that out for everyone, just what we've been supporting there. And then, like you said, I think October 7th in the last 4 months has been the ultimate kind of inciting incident for people to just completely drop whatever facade was there. I can't stress enough. Like we're talking about, Jesse Brown and obviously defending Selena Robinson now. That's the whole thing. He's throwing his body on the tracks for that.
Yeah.
Can't be stressed enough though that when pro Palestine, excuse me, activists targeted Indigo,
Yeah.
which is the CEO of Indigo is Heather Reisman, who she's not only a Zionist but actually funds, like it contributes to this fund that supports people that go want to go volunteer for the
A
IDF to go
charity.
shoot
She gets a
Palestinian
tax
kids.
break for it too.
Yeah. And when people engaged in a direct action at Indigo, Jesse described Indigo as just a Jewish owned bookstore. These activists going after this like Jewish owned bookstore. This is a massive $1 billion conglomerate. Like this is a huge chain of bookstores that has in fact swallowed up most local like bookstores. Like it's become this big uh national chain, $1 billion conglomerate. And Jesse Brown's describing it like it's this small little mom and pop
The
operation.
shop around the
Um,
corner.
yeah,
What a
exactly.
fucking
This little
loser.
Jewish owned bookstop. Like it's fucking crazy. And like it's the thing, like it's with the incident with Heather Reisman, the thing with Selena Robinson, people are taking this time to point at direct action being done towards people that are supporting the mass murder of Palestinians and framing it like it's the Kristallnacht. They're framing it as if
Yeah.
they're the victims. They're
Yeah.
the victims of violence. They're the victims of discrimination. And that's, I think, the ultimate like sickness of Zionism really is the fact that they can engage in the most depraved, barbaric violence, all the while acting as if they're the ones being victimized. And how they like this is happening to us. People are being mad. People are getting mad that we just killed tens of thousands of little kids. Oh, we're the victims now. We're being the victim of anti-Semitism. This is just like the Holocaust. This is just like the Kristallnacht or like any of these kind of horrifying incidents. And I think that was the thing that people are pointing to as kind of the hateful statements as or hateful messages, like Jagmeet Singh described it. This note outside Selena Robinson's office that said Zionism equals fascism, and or Zionism equals Nazism. And I'm sorry, but like if you don't want to be like equated to being a Nazi, then you should stop acting like a Nazi. Like that's there's no other way to describe what Israel is engaging in right now, what they've been engaging in over the last several decades. You're keeping people in a concentration camp for the last 20 years. You routinely drop bombs on residential neighborhoods in this camp. Um, you're mass murdering tens of thousands of people. There's stories today about like Palestinian civilians like they're getting kept
Yeah.
being kept in stadiums, they're being stripped down and humiliated and degraded. And it's like this is like there's no other way to describe it. Like there's literally no other way to describe it. So but instead of like internalizing that or maybe asking questions about why people are making these comparisons, it's just like, oh no, the rise of anti-Semitism right now is just so alarming. uh the way people are being targeted like that just because of their identity and not the fact that they're supporting genocide. And that's truly one of I think the most sick things about what we've been seeing over the last couple of months.
Yeah, just to, I mean, I'm gonna let you go now because let you go soon because, but I wanted to ask you about like what, and I think this is kind of like this is one of the kind of orbiting issues in Canadian politics, which is the question of immigration, right? Immigration, and this is also like I feels like this is like a carbon copy of the U.S. where it's a kind of it's a dog whistle, like anxieties around immigration is like a dog whistle for a certain class of voter. But that class, which is traditionally we think of them as this like, oh, right wing chuds or whatever, is that it's actually going to be bigger than that. And it's strangely tied to economic the economic anxiety under neoliberalism. And so like you have this very cynical game that like Canadian policymakers and like the capitalist ruling class play, which is, well, our population doesn't reproduce enough. Millennials especially aren't reproducing anything close to like what we need for like labor costs to keep them low. Of course, that's what that means.
Yeah.
So we're gonna have to bring in an army of people from around the world, and this is like a typical game in a lot of like so-called like in a lot of the global north, right? Like immigration is a spigot, is like a human spigot that they turn on, and it's largely to the benefit of the sort of capitalist ruling class. And so on the one hand, like, yeah, like these people are necessary. Like if you want to get your Tim Hortons, like you need to look at a South Asian face and you need to like answer to that
Yeah.
South Asian face. So like the sort of the like
Yeah.
the and this is so troubling for probably millions of Canadians. Maybe I don't know how real it is, this anxiety, because it's been around for a while. Immigration isn't new to Canada. In fact, it's built on immigration, especially white European immigration. Like that's what the settler colonial project is. It's an
Yeah.
ongoing colonization. And so now that the sort of like the ostensible whiteness of this project, of that immigration project, can't be relied upon, that like, yeah, like the same problems of like population decline in like the global north and historically white European countries, it's also affecting them too. And so like the source of migration, the source of this like cheap labor pool, right, are these like not largely, but I mean, and they're not predominantly, but like a good number of them are South Asian, and a lot of them come through these what are essentially exploitative student programs, right? Like students, like this class of there's a class like they haven't like the universities have stagnated in this country. Universities and colleges, secondary and higher education, they it's stagnated partly because of neoliberal funding and like the cuts and like the abuse of education as like this easy thing you can just beat on to like like to help make your name as a politician. I remember that. You probably remember too, Mike Harris. That was
Yeah.
like their base. When we were kids, there was like education chaos because like conservatives were
Yeah.
like, it's
Absolutely.
fun to beat up on teachers. And it like riles up our base because people hate teachers, the fact that they have 2 months off. So it was like this game that they played that like played out for us in like chaotic ways. We had like two, I think you and I are roughly the same age. So like we had two strikes, major strikes when we were like in school that like shut down schools. And it's like this is like a game they play. And like one of the things though is that like this the immigration is bigger, the immigration question, so called, is way bigger than any political party, but the way they'll cash in is reflective of the sort of neoliberal like sheen that the parties have. So like I don't know, I've been saying this for a while informally, but there is going to be a backlash coming, like, and there's going to be an angry, mean, like frothing at the mouth, like backlash. We kind of got a taste of it through, I would say, like, through like the fuck Trudeau stuff. You kind of get a taste of it, but it's so stupid because it's all
Yeah.
fixated on liberals. Whereas, like, it's not like a kind of it's not like a kind of like comprehensive sort of materialist understanding of how politics works, but it's only fixated on liberals,
Yeah.
which is like a typical conservative chud thing to do. That like, oh, it's just the liberals' fault that I'm poor. It's the liberals' fault that like that neoliberalism hurts me. And it's like, sorry, buddy, it's called neoliberalism. It's bigger than any party. But like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you feel that like this next election that's coming? Because correct me if I'm wrong, Trudeau's not going to be on the ticket, right? Like he's maxed out his chips.
That's been my attitude. Like I don't want to predict what's going to happen. I guess my feeling about this is that if he feels like there's a wave coming that's going to wipe them out, he's going to gracefully walk into the ride his horse into the sunset and say like, well, my work here is done, and probably leave someone like Melanie Jolie or Chrystia Freeland to take the fall for him.
Big
Um
time.
that's been kind of my view on that, and right now, like that does look like what's about to happen. There is this big backlash coming, and like you talked about when you talk about the that kind of like anti-immigrant aspect of our sort of reactionary wave that's happening right now, like that's all tied into these like fucked up anti-Semitic conspiracy theories as well, about how Trudeau and the World Economic Forum, like they're not just like importing people into the country for work or whatever, but they're trying to destroy the white race. They're trying to bring people in to like destroy the white race and contribute to this whole like great replacement kind of theory. Um, but yeah, I think like you talked about, I think it's been kind of under the surface, simmering under the surface for a long time. And I think that's the main issue. The main thing is that like we're living in this kind of like decaying neoliberal economic structure where all the results of the reforms of the 80s and 90s now are kind of like bearing fruit. We talked about the housing crisis in like every major city. It's basically this kind of standard of living that used to be available to people is just going away. The idea that you can own a home, that idea is for a whole generation basically is being lost. And I think there's been this really kind of reductive uh, effort to blame the liberals for that, and they should have some blame for it. But like you pointed out, it's not the liberals. The conservatives were happy to oversee all this process as well. The deindustrialization, the the support for the wealthiest classes and this kind of stuff that has led to all these major economic consequences. And like I think about I talk about my hometown of Brockville, which has definitely become since I lived there way more diverse. And I think about someone there that maybe at one point there used to be industry there. There was like a Procter and Gamble factory. All that stuff went away in the 90s during that period. And I think if you don't really have any kind of materialist analysis of what's going on around you, or you're listening to like right wing cranks explain it, you look around, you see that things are way more diverse. You see that housing is more expensive. It's way more difficult to get a job that you can raise a family on, and you can put two and two together and be like, this is the problem. This is the issue here. And I think that's a lot of people take that message, which is totally not accurate. And they blame the people that are coming into the country rather than the wealthy and powerful people who outsource these jobs and who are price gouging at the grocery store and who are building $1 million McMansions rather than affordable housing. But it's much easier to blame the South Asian people and other immigrants that are coming in for that than to blame the actual people that have power in our society. Like that's the thing when you talk about housing with a lot of these people, and I try to kind of like get messages out there to speak to some of these concerns, but I hear the same thing. It's just a supply and demand thing. There's just not enough housing. There's too many immigrants. We don't have enough resources to bring all these people in, and then that's why it's driving up the price. And they don't stop to think about what that means and what the solution for that could be. Like in our political class across the whole political spectrum, whether it's the NDP or the conservatives or the liberals, when it comes to housing, it feels like the only solution we ever hear about is like, let's just give the right combination of like tax cuts and incentives to the real estate developers, and then just ask them really nicely to build affordable housing with
Yeah.
these incentives that we're giving them. And lo and behold, they don't fucking do it.
Yeah.
And like we're not building housing that people can afford to live in. Um, to say nothing of the fact that it's not even a supply and demand issue because there's so much empty housing and vacant housing that people just don't even live in that's being held as speculative assets. And I mean that's a whole other aspect of it as well. It's like we're going to blame the foreign. We're going to ban foreign ownership of real estate. So you won't have any Chinese people coming in and owning real estate. And the idea that real estate just shouldn't be a speculative asset for anybody, whether they're foreign or domestic, is just not discussed. The idea that the state should just be building housing and saying it costs this much is just not discussed. The only solution we have are these neoliberal public-private partnerships where we incentivize developers, and just the problem just continues getting worse and worse. And then the more people are struggling, the more people are getting see the prices of groceries going up, the price of housing going up, all these economic consequences, which are consequences of neoliberalism. The easier it becomes then, especially when no one on the left side is offering an alternative to that, the easier it is for like cranks and demagogues and right wing people to just scapegoat immigrants and blame all the problems on people coming into this country. And a lot of people are buying that. So it does seem like now we're on the verge of this like real reactionary wave coming into the next election cycle. And that's something that I've been kind of worried about, ever since Trump was elected. I was kind of like, we're always kind of chasing the political trends of the United States. When's our big reactionary populist moment coming? And the can keeps getting kind of kicked down the road there. And it really now feels like with this kind of, the convoy thing was like kind of an early sign of that. You see, however ridiculous it is, you see Pierre Poilievre somewhat successfully like speaking to these people's economic concerns, and our media class obviously willing to give him this kind of undeserved credit for that. Oh, he's speaking to Canadians' economic concerns, these coffee table issues, while he's not offering any actual meaningful solutions to any of these problems. Um, So it does seem like we're on the verge now of some kind of like big reactionary wave election. Um, and I don't know. I don't know what that's going to mean. You know, I think it is going to lead to a lot more scapegoating of people, immigrants. I think it's going to lead to a lot of these economic consequences getting a lot worse. And, you know, I don't know where that's going to leave us. But I guess that's one of the reasons that, you know, I'm trying to do the kind of analysis or commentary that I'm doing. And so I'm glad that you're doing what you're doing. So at least there's some people, we're not getting invited to opine on these things on CBC or Global News or in the National Post or the Globe and Mail or wherever else. But at least there's some people that are trying to like meaningfully, you know, address like why these things are happening and why we're headed in this direction.
Rob, it's always a pleasure to talk about bleak trends in Canadian politics with you. Thank you very much for your
Yeah,
time. Everybody, you should check
it's
out
my
his Twitch
brand.
channel. You got a lot of followers. It's growing a lot since our last episode. You
It's
got over
growing. Yeah,
10K.
I just passed 10K on Twitch.tv. I do my show TRRS every single day, starting around noon Eastern. Twitch.tv/Rob Rousseau. I do a lot of interviews there. I brought back my podcast recently, actually, 49th Parallel, and that's kind of a place where I can let some of these interviews and stuff that I do there live. And yeah, doing this, talking about this stuff every single day. So the more the merrier. You want people want to check it out.
Well, I'll link to that in the show notes. And thank you, Rob. This was always a pleasure.